cash assistance receipts is on the rise again, indicating that families continue to face economic insecurity. And small business revenues remain depressed. The slow recovery continues to affect our revenues. But thankfully, President Biden's American Rescue Plan provides a much needed shot in the arm for our economy and for our budget. So now I want to turn to the mayor's executive budget for fiscal year 2022. The budget has gone up significantly since the preliminary budget in January. The modified budget for this fiscal year 2021 is $100.7 billion, $5.6 billion more than in January. And the budget the mayor has proposed for next year is $98.6 billion, up $6.2 billion. After that, spending is projected to start rising again. And my office believes we will see additional tax revenues this year and next above what the mayor's office projects. But that will still leave budget gaps that remain close to $4 billion a year through the end of the financial plan in fiscal year 2025. The spending increases this year and next are fueled by an additional $15.7 billion in federal COVID-related aid in the budget. That includes $1.4 billion in increased reimbursements from FEMA for COVID disaster-related expenses and additional funds from the CARES Act. We're receiving nearly $7 billion in federal funds to be used for education purposes, passed through to us in the state budget. And the city stands to receive $5.9 billion from the president's stimulus bill that it will be able to use for a wide range of purposes. Just this last week, in fact, we received the first installment of $2 billion in direct aid from the American Rescue Plan for our city. Now, the most important question we can ask about this budget is this: how are these federal funds being used? This is an unprecedented amount of money to address an unprecedented crisis. The budget, as it was presented, was far from transparent, but my office has gone through and analyzed all $15.7 billion, and we've identified 5 broad purposes. So the first and largest is responding to and recovering from the pandemic and beginning to reopen our economy. Over half of the total funds will go to these initiatives. This category includes $2.25 billion for the public health response to the pandemic. And this category includes $2.25 billion for things like vaccine and immunization, for testing and tracing, for safety and reopening schools, and more. The administration has also proposed $2.8 billion for initiatives to help with reopening our economy and assisting those in need. The biggest single piece of this category, though, is $3.6 billion in DOE programs. Some of the purposes of this spending are clearer than others. There's $850 million for academic recovery and student support services over the next 3 years to address our children's learning loss and their social and emotional needs after a year out of school. That's the good news. But there's also $1.4 billion for something labeled operational support and $840 million for quote unquote programmatic and instructional support. We're going to need the administration to fill in much more detail on how these funds will be used for these broad categories in DOE. The mayor has also proposed using $866 million in stimulus funds to restore previously proposed budget cuts, primarily in the Department of Education, but also to restore the street basket collections that were cut last year by the Department of Sanitation. The mayor is also using stimulus funds to defer savings he had sought from the city's labor unions this year and next, and to replace city funds for general budget purposes. Now, one of the major uses of stimulus funds in the financial plan, however, is for new programs or the expansion of existing programs. The biggest initiative here is the expansion of Universal 3K, a goal I wholeheartedly support, and I congratulate the mayor on this initiative. There are other new or expanded programs that the budget would fund using stimulus dollars, such as expanding and improving senior services, and also providing adequate overhead reimbursement for our nonprofit social service contractors. Also providing access to counsel and housing court. These are all important initiatives that warrant support from all of us. And I believe we must make sure that we have a plan for how we're going to pay for them permanently. And that's the problem with using stimulus funds for new programs, how to pay for them when the stimulus funds run out. So how should we be using our stimulus funds? I believe in the short term, the priority must be the businesses across the city that have been hit hardest by the shutdown. Recently, my office released our second survey of the experiences of MWBEs during the pandemic. We found that half of MWBs had to lay off or furlough employees during the pandemic, and that nearly a third expect they won't be able to pay rent in the next 3 months. Businesses need our help. And despite all the stimulus funds available to provide budget relief and to make up for the revenues we've lost as a result of the economic shutdown, the mayor's plan does little to reduce the gaps we're facing in the future. We still are not asking our agencies to look closely at their budgets for savings to see how they could provide their services as efficiently as possible. If every agency worked as hard to find operational savings as our public finance team does with OMB to fund savings from refinancing our city bonds, well, those out-year gaps would probably be a lot lower than they are. And we could be using these savings to rebuild our reserves, to create a budget cushion for the future. As things stand, we've done very little in this financial plan to bring our reserves back up to the level I've long recommended of at least 12% of city funds spending. This is critical. In fact, our budget cushion has fallen to under 8% with no plan for increasing it. We must have an ongoing savings plan to match our spending plan so that we can sustain the services New Yorkers want in the future. One thing we should not do is rush through unnecessary budget actions that will save us money now, but cost us money in the future. The city's actuary, working with the mayor, has proposed changes in the way we calculate how much we contribute each year to the city's pension systems for city worker retirement benefits. Now, let me say at the outset, it's a complicated calculation, but I'm going to explain to you how it works. The pension funds have a target of rate of return on their investments. It's set in state law and it's currently 7%. If returns fall short of that target, then we have to increase contributions to make up the difference. The actuary is seeking to lower that target rate of return. Now, that may sound good, but actually, if we assume we're going to make less on our investments, we have to pay more to make up the difference. So that would cost taxpayers over $400 million a year when it's fully phased in. But in the 8 years I've been controller, our investments have exceeded that target return. Remember, 7%. We've earned 8.65% on average. Now, generally, any difference between the target return and actual returns is phased in over time. But in return for lowering the target rate of return, which, as I said, will increase pension contributions in future years, the actuary and the mayor are proposing that we speed up the phase-in the recent market returns. And what that would do, that would lower how much we have to pay into the pension funds, with most of the savings coming this year and next. In effect, a deal has been made to provide the mayor with additional cash now and to push the costs off to later. Now, as I said, changing the assumed rate of return requires legislation in Albany and cannot be done unilaterally by the actuary. And quite frankly, the city doesn't need those savings now. In fact, personal income tax revenues this year are likely to exceed the mayor's executive plan projection by over $1 billion. We've been here before. This is not new. 20 years ago, the city under Mayor Giuliani agreed to a market restart that recognized the growth of earnings in the pension funds and lowered the city's contributions in the short term. But you know what happened? That left the funds in dire straits when the tech bubble burst the next year and the stock market tumbled. It took a long time to recover because once you recognize all the gains, you've got no cushion left to absorb losses. I know this is complicated, but this is a critical moment in our budget and our pension funds. And I would urge that we are cautious, that we build consensus between all parties, Albany, the city, and our pension board of trustees. Let's slow down and give these major steps the thoughtful consideration they're due, rather than trying to jam them through for some extra cash now and more liability in the future. And finally, we need to make investments to build a strong foundation for the new economy. We've seen how slowly jobs are returning. Well, the bad news is some of those old jobs are never coming back. But other sectors like tech and healthcare can't find enough workers to fill the jobs. We need to train our workers now for the jobs of the future. We should be using stimulus funds to make capital investments for the future. Capital investments are a smart use of one-time stimulus funds. We can use that stimulus cash to make investments that will pay dividends down the road and save money in the future through lower borrowing costs. The American Rescue Plan explicitly mentions two areas of capital spending that funds can be used for: broadband access and water and sewer systems. We all know broadband access is critical, especially for our children, but also water and sewer systems need to be upgraded as well. We know we have urgent needs in both these areas, but the city has not proposed using the ARP funds for any investments in them. So let's make sure every New Yorker has high-speed broadband access. Too many of our children in public housing didn't have broadband, in homeless shelters, and that hurt them in terms of remote learning. And we have a real challenge getting those students back up to speed. But let's not make the same mistake again. We have funds, we can really build our broadband. And also, we got to challenge our aging water and sewer system because we got to get ready for the challenges of climate change. Because building for climate resiliency is imperative for the future of our sea level city. And again, this is where we have to invest. Now, what we're facing today is a defining moment for our city. We need to use this moment to build for our future, to get our house in order, to invest for the new economy, to correct the inequities exposed by the pandemic, and lift up New Yorkers who were underserved and overexposed. This should be our North Star. And I'm glad to be here with all of you and happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand on Zoom and I'll call on you. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions from the press at this time. So I think we're all set here, sir, and we'll follow up with anyone online.
Well, thank you everybody for listening, and we will be at the City Council